Hello, everyone. I'm Jason Cohen, the author of An Introduction to the Art and Science of Chinese Tea Ceremony. Today, we're discussing Book 1, Chapter 1, Section 1, Levels in Practice. Here to talk about this chapter is our editorial team, Patrick Penny, Ryan Ahn, and the occasional contributor, Zongjun Li, joining us from Shanghai. Hello, Pat, Ryan, and Zongjun.
Hey, Jason.
Hello.
Hello, everybody.
My first question will be to Pat. Pat, what was the most impactful message in this chapter?
I think when I look at this chapter, the most impactful message is that the boundaries between these levels of practice is fuzzy, and that as a practitioner, we may move throughout them. We may move up and down, in and out. As time flows, our skill level will ebb and flow with it, and we'll, over time, of course, improve. But there's a lot of factors that will impact that. So I think it's the understanding that you're never just sitting at one level, but that your technique and your abilities to brew tea, form, at a certain level are always going to be changing, and they change with the season, change with the weather, your mindset. So I think that's what I really took away from this article.
Ryan, same question to you.
Yeah, I would echo Pat's comments, and that these are all layers of skills that can co-develop. And one thing that immediately comes to mind is back at the Tea Institute, we would start everyone just on Gaiwan brewing, primarily because we wanted to get everyone to be really good and to gain a lot of skill, while keeping it incredibly focused versus doing both teapots and Gaiwans. And we also had a lot of random people flow through that, we didn't necessarily want to put Yixing teapots in their hands to begin with. But it was always interesting seeing all these really good brewers who tested into the Institute about 6 months later, try to brew in a teapot for the first time. A good 50% of the people just couldn't hold it. Like, it was too hot, it was too awkward, and it was like learning how to walk again for them. So seeing these really good brewers who are very good at brewing in a Gaiwan have to start from the beginning, and I was one of those people, shows how layered this approach is as you add in new skills, new techniques, new wares into your practice.
And I love that, Ryan, because I think about all the people I saw come through the Institute holding teapots for the first time, which is just brings a smile to my face. But we look, I think, at the Western tea consumers, and maybe I'm thinking just about the Instagram community, but you see people getting into tea and picking up teapots right away. It's so different to the approach that we had taught. And I really think, what is that where the base foundation of their skill is starting to be built? What does it look like when that kind of person moves to a Gaiwan? Is it important to them to move to a Gaiwan?
Zongjun, continuing on this line of questioning, is there merit to leveling skills in a specific order? Do you think that the route that we took previously at the Institute was the correct route, or do you think that there are many correct routes, or do you think there are no correct routes?
Yeah, pretty interesting question. To me, that I personally found that the route that we construct and took in the Institute, it tends to really build up this set of framework and shared mindset and vocabulary as a very valuable foundation for any further education and meaningful discussion within the community. So I think that the way that we start off as students and later on as professional tea practitioner were very well constructed and result in very good self development within each of the institute members. But on the other hand, I feel like that a lot of people that I've met in different communities, they took slightly or sometimes very differently way of approaching to tea culture, tea ceremony. And oftentimes, a lot of mindset or knowledge converged at the end, like utility of certain wares or suitability of different tea to different shapes or different water types. They all came from sets of practice and comparison. And I think although maybe we start off from different wares or different environment or different availability of different teas, but throughout a organized, education path, I feel like that at the end of the day, a lot of these points will converge.
Pat or Ryan, do either of you have something to debate from Zongjun's answer?
I would debate that I don't think these streams always converge. I've had the good fortune to meet a ton of tea practitioners in professional capacity as well as in that of a hobby capacity. And certainly I've seen where these streams or techniques do not converge. I will say I think the largest factor is the people that we surround ourselves with, right? So the other tea practitioners that we come into frequent or occasional contact with, I think they really help to inform our practice, whether we think what we're doing is positive and we continue to do it, or whether we see that there's a better way, right? And we discontinue some of our technique. Another is, the availability of a teacher. So having someone who has much more experience that can help shape your path, whether through direct conversation or indirect teachings, Zen learning. I think that also really helps to direct the stream of your learning, towards a path that might converge with their other students, but might not necessarily converge with the whole of tea practitioners. And I've definitely can name a lot of people whose practice are very different than mine, and I might not agree with what they do. I'm happy that they enjoy their tea practice, but I choose purposely to propagate different technique and a different praxis than them.
Yeah, I think those who share the same objective. So we have a very sensory first, very empirical method for brewing tea, where you really use all of your senses. And in fact, Jason will talk about this later in a different chapter. We use aroma differential brewing, which is how we teach everyone to really utilize all of their senses to know when a tea is done, to build up an intuition, to know how the thickness of your gaiwan, the turbulence of your pour, the type of water, how long you let it steep, how you decant the tea, and how all of those parameters influence the flavor. And so while we start everyone off on gaiwans, if you imagine some parallel practice where everyone's starting on teapots, so long as we're having the same objective and a very sensory first approach and an empirical framework, I see no reason to believe why those two set of techniques or practices wouldn't converge on similar insights.
Ryan, staying with you, what did you think was missing from this chapter?
Not so much missing as it was sort of an endpoint at the article that provoked a thought around in-person learning and how important a sensory first set of techniques and practice, and how necessary that is to have feedback in being with other people, which, we've also touched upon this in a couple other areas, but what does that look like on the internet? You see all sorts of like online tasting groups where you have, suppose you have everyone drinking the same tea and talking about it at the same time, or you have wine tasting events online, very similar idea, where you're trying to replicate a shared sensory experience. But in terms of moving someone's practice forward and their skill forward, unless you have a feedback loop, it's really hard to improve because tea is an unfinished product. And that's what Gongfu Cha is making it the best tasting tea you can transform it into. And when you are your only feedback loop, you can't ultimately progress to the highest level of the practice, being phenomenology and creating an experience for others.
Zongjun, same question to you. What did you think was missing from this chapter?
Yeah, I want to maybe further echo with Ryan's point that, I think this is a ultimate constraint of how this content being presented in the internet, because there is a lack of physical contact with with each other to be able to really understand how phenomenological approach can really help one understand or getting in interest in certain subject throughout a creation of a experiment, which I don't think, unfortunately, we have the capability to be able to realize that.
Taken to its logical extreme, do you think we will see things like VR or AR tea tastings in the future, tea ceremonies in the future?
That's a great question. I don't know. For a cup of tea or a cup of coffee, there are so many volatile compounds that emit into the air for people to smell or to taste, and I don't think we not yet achieved that level of technology to be able to represent that level of complexity in a presentation.
I don't think AR tea tasting is that far off. I look at some of the groups that already exist online, thinking about maybe Discord, right, or other mediums that connect people, whether that's with video or audio technology, right? So we already have a lot of tea groups that meet via some forum online to talk and to discuss tea. I don't think it's that far off that they'll put on a pair of goggles or they'll have their phone out with some kind of app that can, help enhance that experience in some way with each other. I think we're looking at, maybe 10 more years and we'll have some really interesting platforms for, shared tea experiences via the internet.
In the late 1990s, early 2000s, Nickelodeon sent out mail for scratch and sniff stickers, and when a certain symbol appeared on the TV, you were supposed to scratch and sniff in order to have a shared experience for what they were showing on TV. Between that and Minecraft already has many of the Chinese historical palaces or terracotta warriors or gardens that have been recreated on the internet. I don't think, unfortunately, that virtual tea tastings are that far off, though I will probably not personally attend.
We'll let you know how they are.
Switching gears, Ryan, where will this chapter generate contention or debate in the tea world?
Not so much debate, but I think a lot of the people in the tea world, especially in the West, view their tea drinking experience as connoisseurship, which is a different lens to put on it as compared to this framework. So if you engage in buying samples, working through them, understanding how things like dry versus wet storage conditions impact the flavor of pu'er, different batch runs of things like 7542, and a wide set of building up a base of knowledge based on a lot of context and engaging in this type of connoisseurship is a different lens to view their tea practice than this framework. I think the first two parts definitely apply. Utilitarian, everyone's got to learn to brew tea, otherwise you cannot experience it. And structural functionalism, because everyone needs to learn how to express those flavors and things that they're paying a lot of money for. Right? If you're using terrible water or terrible wares to brew, a $300 or $400 pu'er cake that you're buying, you're not allowing that tea to live up to its potential. But the final meta theory that you put on top of it around phenomenology is creating an experience that's beyond connoisseurship. And in fact, it takes into account the knowledge of all of the guests to create the best experience possible. And a great way to anecdotally feel this or think about this is anytime any of our listeners have sat down to a tea ceremony where they were a guest, they had no context, they didn't necessarily know what they were drinking, and I'm sure we've all had that experience. And when you have a really good practitioner, they just teleport you into a different time, a different space. And it's all for the purpose of creating the best experience for you. It's almost hospitality. So I think your lens is just fundamentally different than the way most people are having these conversations.
Pat, same question to you, focusing on the Western tea world. Do you have any follow-ups for what Ryan said?
Yeah, I want to pick up a little bit on what Ryan said, and then I also have a point about where I think this chapter will generate contention. So a lot of the Western tea consumers, and this has been talked about on various tea blogs, right, are tea hermits. A lot of people are just brewing tea for themselves in their apartment. Maybe they have no tea friends that they drink socially with in person. So they might be doing that online, but they're not meeting people for tea in person. And especially in this past year and a couple months, right? Tea in the time of COVID has been a hermetic experience and a hermetic approach. So I think a lot of the Western tea consumers aren't as concerned with crafting an experience for anyone. And maybe if they are, it's just for themselves or maybe a significant other, right? So I do think that the utilitarian and structural functionalist framework is something that everyone does have to work through, whether they apply those words or not. But that next level of phenomenology, people might, and Western tea practitioners in particular, I don't think are as concerned with crafting an experience or with making sure that guests, if they are drinking with some, are being brought into the tea ceremony in a way that they're going to understand at a similar level what the host is trying to show them about these teas or wares. There's a lot of unspoken, right, knowledge that's trying to be transferred as you're crafting this experience. And I think that's a skill that needs to be built. And a lot of Western tea practitioners aren't focused on it. I would actually say that maybe from the industry view, more industry people are focused on it because you're always thinking probably about selling a product. So how do you bring someone into that, and make them want to buy the product? Switching a little bit back to your original question, where do I think this book is going to, have contention or controversy? So I think the last words of this chapter are individuals who teach themselves from books or blogs tend to lack well-developed technique. And you go on to say in the footnote that this includes your book and that books and blogs are not a replacement for experience. This is a statement that I wholeheartedly agree with. You do not learn tea from reading about tea. You learn a lot of facts about tea, and your tea knowledge, of course, needs to be built if you want to discuss facets of tea. But to brew tea well, you cannot learn that from a book. You need to practice and hopefully practice with people who are also good at it or excited to learn about it. And if you're very lucky, you practice with someone who's respected by a lot of people as a teacher, and your practice will be guided into a direction where you develop good technique and you develop them time over time and replace bad technique that you might have picked up on your own. So this, is a point that I think a lot of people who learn exclusively through books or blogs are going to take personally. And I know you don't mean it personally, but it can be seen as an attack, right, on the tea ceremony and tea skills that they've developed at this point through just reading, through knowledge.
Yeah, just like a very famous saying from the Han Dynasty, you can never talk about wars and battles on paper.
Dongjun, thank you for jumping in there. You are a Chinese national and you're based in Shanghai. So the same question to you, except from the Chinese practitioner perspective. Where do you think you would find agreement or disagreement with this section amongst Chinese practitioners in China?
Well, I think that speaking from personal experience, I think a lot of tea practitioners in China will actually find themselves in high alignment of the idea that being talked about in this chapter, especially at the end where we talk about how the ultimate goal is to essentially create a experience so that one can draw the interest or foster interest from others into tea culture, tea ceremony. I think that's really something that a lot of tea practitioners in China has been dedicated to, and they essentially have this very common mentality that I don't know if you guys have ever been to, I know you guys have been to tea houses in China, but maybe some of our listeners have not been to, even been to China. But whenever you walk into a Chinese tea house, you are always welcomed by the host with a cup of tea, and you sit down, you not talking about like buying any stuff, buying any wares, buying any tea, but to really just like enjoy the tea that either they grow or they roast or they make or they are very passionate about. So I think that this kind of mindset is like really deeply rooted in a lot of tea lovers and tea practitioners here. It's not to try to sell you anything, try to impress you by anything, but to offer you a good time, a good experiment with a cup of good tea. So,
my final question, Songjun, do you think that the phenomenological approach is more closely aligned with Chinese culture than other approaches to tea?
yeah, I definitely agree, because tea to Chinese people are really like water or any kind of like daily beverages. Like a lot of people here, their first exposure to tea are definitely not a well-picked high mountain oolong brewed in a well-crafted gaiwan or yixing teapot. It's all started from maybe from the thermos of your grandpa or from a good conversation in the family, and you start to foster your interests in this fragrant beverage that's always sitting in front of you. Either it's in a meal or either it's just in a conversation on the table. So yeah, I definitely agree that a lot of people here, they do not start with the physicality of the implements, but from the mentality, from the feeling, from the memories of all of the past memories of good time that this very beverage has brought to them. So,
well, everyone, that is all the time that we have for this episode. Thank you for joining us on this edition of Tea Technique Editorial Conversations. And please join us again for a discussion of the next chapter on Chashi.